Hello there. My name is James Bailey Blackshear. I'd like to thank the library and the museum for allowing me to talk about a new book that I have co-authored with Glen Sample Ely called Confederates and Comancheros, Skullduggery and Double Dealing in the Texas-New Mexico Borderlands. This new book, published by the University of Oklahoma Press, has a release date of September 30th of 2021, this upcoming fall. Again, my co-author is Glen Sample Ely, who you may have heard of, a very well-recognized Southwestern historian who is mainly focused on Texas, but his award-winning books touch on a variety of topics in the Southwest. Books such as Where the West Begins, Debating Texas Identity. A second book, The Texas Frontier and the Butterfield Overland Mail, 1858 to 1861. A book that he researched and put together over 20 years that has won many awards. And his latest book, published last year by the University of Oklahoma Press, Murder in Montague, Frontier Justice and Retribution in Texas, already winning awards. So while Dr. Ely has focused on Texas, the scope and breadth of his research certainly includes all of the Southwest. I have a couple of books mainly focused on New Mexico, Honor and Defiance, A History of the Las Vegas Land Grant in New Mexico, generally about the city of Las Vegas and San Miguel County, but also about the Southwest, as is Fort Bascom, soldiers, Comancheros, and Indians in the Canadian River Valley. Fort Bascom was a fort located a few miles north of Tucumcari, which faced the Texas Panhandle, something of a tripwire during the Civil War, looking for a second Confederate invasion, but ended up being a place where soldiers patrolled against the Comanches, the Kiowa, the Apaches, and were always on the lookout for Comancheros. So this book about the Texas-New Mexico borderlands is generally focused on the 1860s to the 1870s. But you think borderlands, certain topics may come to mind, but this would also include events during the Civil War that really hadn't been written about too much, such as the Union Army's control over West Texas during the Civil War. Texas was not some independent Confederate state that wasn't touched by the Union Army. General James H. Carleton, commanding general of New Mexico and the Union Army, he controlled a lot of that state during the Civil War. And as a result of the Union Army controlling a lot of West Texas, there's a lot of spying going on by Confederate Texans. There's a lot of double dealing going on because, you know, all armies need food. Certainly the Confederate Army needed beef, and Texas cattlemen were willing to sell the Confederate Army a lot of beef, but they were also willing to sell it surreptitiously to the Union Army. Little has been written about this. This book will investigate and detail some of the first cattle drives into New Mexico, which were during the Civil War, led by Texas cattlemen selling to the Union Army. So this book is about connections. It's about trails. And certainly some of those early cattle trails from Texas to New Mexico are investigated in detail. So you'll have the cattle drives not only during the Civil War, but after, when there's a huge demand for cattle in New Mexico as the United States Army moves west, builds a lot of forts to gain control of the Southern Plains Indians. And as they begin to gain control of the Southern Plains Indians, they put them, you know, on reservations, and they need food. A lot of the food that will be sent to these reservations is Texas cattle. This book is also about the licensed Comanchero trade. You may have heard of the Comanchero trade. There's a lot of historiography about the Comanchero trade, but that's generally about the illegal or illicit trade, the whiskey, the weapons for cattle. But long before those books were written, in the 1840s, the Hispanic traders in New Mexico were going to Texas legally. They'd have to go to Santa Fe and get a license. There's a lot of documents that detail these licenses in the archives for the Superintendent of Indian Affairs. They have been little used by historians. This book delves into those legal documents. They not only tell who the Comancheros, legal Comancheros were, but who their suppliers were, which this is a huge focus of this book. Who supplied the Comancheros? It's certainly the most successful merchants and people that lived in New Mexico. And we will certainly get into that. Those merchants who lead the territory, both in politics and their economy, are going to be revealed in this book. Along with the licensed legal trade, this book also details the illegal trade. Certainly that has already been written about. But putting the two components together, the legal trade with the illegal trade, you get a much more in-depth look at the Comanchero trade and its impact on the New Mexico economy. It helped to fuel that economy during those territorial years, certainly in the 1860s and 1870s. Anybody that could have the ability to get involved in the trade did. As a result, as in any era, if you want to look into the history of politics, you follow the money. Where was the money in territorial New Mexico in the 1860s and 1870s? It was tied to the cattle trails. It was tied to the cattle drives. It was tied to the beef that was being sold and traded to the army and elsewhere. So we'll look into that. So again, Texas, New Mexico, Borderlands, what's that about? It's about connecting cultures. It's about illustrating where the trails were from Fort Davis to Fort Union, both illegal and legal trails, from Horseshoe Canyon, Horseshoe Crossing to Puerto de Luna, from Camp Colorado to Fort Sumner, and also from Chaparrito, kind of the heartland of the Comancheros, to Quitique, one of the Comanches' main base camps to trade with the Comancheros. All these trails are detailed both in the text and in 4 beautiful maps that are within this book. So if you're going to talk about cattle, illegal and legal, you're going to talk about the Comancheros as well as the Comanches to a certain extent, who provided the cattle to the Comancheros, who were the middlemen for the merchants. At a certain point, the United States Army wants to stop all that. And we'll talk a little about the Red River Wars. Certainly there will be segments related to Colonel Ronald Mackenzie, who helped put an end to the Comanches and the Comancheros in the 1870s. This book will highlight many of the legendary Texas cattlemen that made their fortunes driving cattle, both legal and illegal, into New Mexico and north during these 1860s and 1870s. Also, the entrepreneurs, whether they're from Santa Fe, whether they're from Chaparrito, whether they're from the Comanche country, actual Comanche chiefs, Comanches herding cattle north, just as Charlie Goodnight did, to trade in New Mexico. This book will also touch on shootouts, conflicts related to the Comanchero trade, and cattle raids, both in Texas and in New Mexico. The cattle raids in Texas, maybe mostly about the Comanches and their involvement in these cattle raids. Cattle raids in New Mexico, these was the Texas cattlemen coming to New Mexico to try to take their cattle back, which led to a lot of conflict, a lot of violence. This book is about the traders who acted as middlemen with the Comancheros and the Comanches to acquire the cattle that New Mexico demands. And the butchers have a very significant role in this economy, this New Mexican economy that's tied to cattle, and district attorneys. This book has a lot to do with the political history of New Mexico and how it's enmeshed with the Comanchero trade during the 1860s and 1870s. And also the middlemen, the Hispano rancher that lives up and down the Pecos River and the Gallinas River, who's just out to try to make a living, who's willing to take those wagons full of merchants' goods to the Comanche country to trade for cattle. So please take a moment when you have a chance to investigate, look into this new book that's coming out on September 30th called Confederates and Comancheros, Skullduggery and Double Dealing in the Texas-New Mexico borderland, a history of the individuals that took advantage of this desolate region to try to make a living, both in New Mexico and in Texas. Again, Glenn and I want to thank the library and the museum, as well as the University of Oklahoma Press